this morning, our weird story from the Bible is actually a little bit more troubling than weird. It's a story that you may or may not have heard of. It comes from Genesis chapter 38, and it has to do with Judah. Now, Judah is the son of Jacob and Leah. And remember, Jacob had 12 sons, and the youngest one was Benjamin, and then also Joseph. You know, Joseph that got sold into slavery, and the multicolored coat. Remember that whole story about Joseph? Yeah. So, but this story is about Judah, who is his father. Now, his grandparents were Isaac and Rebekah, and his great-grandparents were Abraham and Sarah. So this guy is in the line of all these great forebearers of the faith. So he's actually the one, when they were going to kill Joseph, they threw him in a pit and they were going to kill him. He's the one that saw this caravan from Egypt come on by. And he said, let's sell him into slavery instead of killing him so we won't have his blood on our hands. That's Judah. So as the story goes, Judah gets married and he has some children. And his eldest child is E-R, that's the guy's name. And he gets a wife for whose name is Tamar. So the text tells us, and we don't really know what this means, that God thought was wicked, so he died and left Tamar a widow. So the tradition back then was for the next son to then marry the widow, and the offspring of that union would be considered the dead husband's child and heir. But the brother didn't want to do this. He didn't want his dead brother to have an offspring, because then that offspring would be the eldest in the family and would inherit the family's wealth. So this is what it says in Genesis 38:9. The second brother's name is Onan, but Onan knew that the child would not be his. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, which was Tamar, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. There you go. And we're told that God thought that was wicked too, and so put this second brother to death as well. So, chapter 11. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law, Tamar, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah, I don't know how to pronounce that, grows up, for he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live with her father's household. So Judah doesn't want to give the third son to Tamar because they keep dying. And so I don't know if he thinks Tamar is cursed or what the problem is here, but he doesn't want to give his third son to her. So time passes, and the third son grows up, and life moves on. Judah's wife dies, but Tamar is still left as a widow in her father's house with no hope of a future if she doesn't have an offspring. So she realizes, since so much time has passed and the third son has grown up, that Judah has no intentions of allowing for this marriage with the third son. So Tamar hatches a plan. She dresses up like a prostitute. We're told she takes off her widow clothes, puts on prostitute clothes and a veil over her face, and she waits one day for Judah to walk by. Okay, here's back to the text on verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "And what will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. He replied, "I'll send you a young goat from my flock." And then she asked, "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" Like, you know, give me some sort of collateral here so I know you're good for it. He said, "What should I pledge to you?" She said, "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand." And he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. So, little clarification here. He's going to give her a goat for payment for being a prostitute. But he doesn't have the goat with him, obviously. And he says, I'll send it to you later. And so she said, okay, well, you have to give me something so I know you'll come back. And she asks for his seal and its cord and his staff. That's kind of the promise that he'll return. The seal and the cord is kind of like a signet ring that identifies him, that he can use to make promises, to kind of sign his name type of a thing. And it was very personalized. And so there was no way anybody else could claim that it belonged to them, because it was a very personalized thing. It's kind of like, you know, give me your credit card and I'll hold on to it until you can come back and pay me. So, long story short, he sends someone afterwards to give her the goat and get back his stuff, and she's gone. And not only is she gone, but the people around are like, what prostitute? There's never been a prostitute here. What are you talking about? And so this is what he says, starting in verse 23. Then Judah said, let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant. Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant by the man who owns these. And she added, see if you recognize these seal and cord and staff. Gotcha. She now has an heir through the family line, and it was Judah. And so good thing she had the seal and the cord and the staff, so she can say, I'm pregnant by this man. And so he realized what had happened. And she kind of won the day here. And then the final line is, Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her my third son. So he kind of admits that he was played and that she's in the right and he was in the wrong. And there you go. Now, two things I want to say about this story. One, you know, it's awful that she had to do this to secure her future, that she had to sleep with her father-in-law, and I'm sure that wasn't a great thing for her, but that's what she had to do back in that time to ensure that she would have a future, to ensure that she would have an heir and a male, or else she couldn't live without that. So it's an awful story in that regard. On the other hand, Tamar is one of the 4 women that is listed in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. And I think that's very intentional, that the Gospel of Matthew, by including these 4 women in the genealogy, are saying, you know, Jesus comes from human people that have to struggle, that do human things that are messy, that are questionable, and yet look what it produced. Look what came from it. And also the fact that women are listed in Jesus's genealogy is a big deal in itself, because that never happens. So that's the story of Tamar. It's in Genesis 38 if you want to check it out and read it for yourself. It's very interesting. And that is your weird story from the Bible for today. Tune in next week.